If this is the first time that you're joining us for a climate science and communications training, we're so excited to have you here. And we've run one of these before. So basically the way that these things work is that last night you may have attended a session run by Aim High Earth about climate science. And this is a session that will take you through a couple of different things. So we have a fantastic team here with us who are going to run us through this agenda tonight. So first of all, we are going to be looking at intersectionality and accessibility in science before looking at the impacts of climate change. Following that, we're going to be talking about how to communicate climate change effectively before finally looking at climate change and the economy. You will also be taking part, we hope, in 2 fantastic breakout rooms run by a brilliant team of facilitators who are volunteering their time to be with us tonight. So we're very grateful for them. But I have to, I've gone too far. I have to introduce the brilliant team who are responsible for making this training a reality. So first, I would love to pass to Danielle Sams to introduce themselves.
Hi. Oh my God. I'm Danielle. You can call me Danny. I use she, they pronouns. I'm from London, but I'm based in Germany. And I'm a PhD student in cognitive neuroscience and a climate justice activist. And that's me, basically.
Thank you, Danny. Then there's me. I work in climate and nature communications, and my research and academia background is in climate science and food systems. So that's me. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Kleczka. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from Poland originally and based in Wales now. And I'm a climate psychology researcher, mostly with a focus on the mental health impacts of the climate crisis and how we can communicate climate change more effectively. And work mostly in research with the Stop Rosebank campaign and also in schools and universities on those topics. That's all from me. Give it to you, Danny.
Oh, are you still sharing the slides?
Do you want to share or shall I? I think I've stopped sharing.
Can you share?
Okay.
Cool. All right, so if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about intersectionality and accessibility in science. So just an overview, intersectionality is an analytical framework which aims to understand basically how different aspects of our socio-political identities like race, gender, and class combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Obviously, our socio-political identities play a huge role in how we're affected by the climate crisis, but we live in a world ruled by white capitalist patriarchal values, so oppression and erasure of marginalized groups is present everywhere. This means a lot of climate science is focused on the global north, with many Black, Asian, and Indigenous peoples not being able to conduct or be represented at all in the science, especially more traditional science or like older papers, for example. So we just want to point out at the beginning that the climate crisis is disproportionately impacting marginalized groups, especially in the global south, even if the science doesn't always represent or show that. And then I want to talk a little bit about why is climate science so inaccessible and non-inclusive for pretty much everyone. So the first thing is obviously money. So often journal articles are only accessible if you work in academia or another role where your job pays for journal access, or of course if you have enough disposable income to spend literally hundreds just probably on 1 or 2 papers. It's wild the cost of these things. But for researchers and research groups to even earn money, publishing in high impact journals is extremely important to getting more funding. So that they can be paid and also fund their research. And publishing is very, very expensive. It often costs thousands just to publish 1 paper. And therefore, funding is extremely competitive because there's not much funding available in the first place. And it depends on what field you're in, but climate science isn't, there's not a huge amount of funding. And a lot of work goes into applications for funding too, and often you get rejected anyway. So it's a lot of time, it's a lot of commitment, and that makes it difficult. Next, dominance and capacity. So researchers from the global north are often able to collect data from the global south because they have access to more funds and resources, and they're able to publish this data, actually contributing to the local development of the science capacity of like the global south country that they choose to do the research in. They also have a lot less to lose by doing research in another country because they won't necessarily be affected by the politics there. Again, it's super important for scientists to publish in high impact journals because it's crucial for career progression and being able to participate in various conferences, talks, and win grant money. I know that I'm always trying to get the free trips from my boss. So honestly, it's like one of the goals really. Not only that, people in the global north, again, have more money, more resources, so they can access conferences, summits, the best universities, general networking events, and they have a lot more opportunity to become known in the field. And this gives their say a lot more weight and their research more weight. They're more likely to be trusted. They're more likely to be published in journals. It increases the chances of them getting grant money, etc. And I know for a fact, like in neuroscience, there are some people who, you know, you read their papers and it's okay, but it's not like worthy of being in the highest impact journal, but it is anyway because they've been in the field so long. And it goes for quite a few fields as well, just nepotism, basically. Next, gender. So the Reuters hot list published a 1,000 most influential climate scientists based on their publication record and social media engagement, so like their Twitter. And it showed that scientists from the global south are underrepresented, with only 5 African scientists out of 1,000 included, and only 122 out of 1,000 were female. And I don't think they included non-binary or other genders. It was only male or female. So that shows there's a huge lack of diversity in published work due to barriers of entry, particularly in higher education and later throughout academic careers, which naturally means that certain aspects of research are just less likely to be looked at due to your worldview. Next, safety is, as mentioned earlier, like global north researchers have less to lose by doing research in some countries because they're not affected by the politics. Some places it's unsafe to conduct field research due to conflicts, or the governments don't want a certain perception of a country to be made public. So they'll just work against people, and sometimes violently, who try to conduct research or speak out on certain issues. And finally, on this section, media and presentation. So there's a lot of bias in media, there's a lot of doomism, and they'll only often publish work that will get a lot of clicks and attention, because obviously they're trying to, you know, beat the algorithm. So yeah, a lot of climate research is published in scientific English. So if English is not like a language you're fluent in, or you're not used to scientific terms because you don't work in science, you're likely not to be able to easily read or understand a lot of this research, and then it also makes it more difficult to even communicate in layman's terms at all. So yeah, that's another thing that just makes it quite inaccessible for a lot of people. So next I'll be talking about some of the health impacts. It's quite a whirlwind. There's a lot of information. I've tried to condense down into like 10 minutes, but I've tried to make it as cohesive, and I've tried to make it make sense. So if you go to the next slide, please, Bobby. First, I want to talk about the climate impacts of heat. So, you know, climate change causes erratic weather patterns, as I'm sure we all noticed this year. It's been getting super hot. It can cause heat waves, droughts, wildfires, increase or worsen disease, and that's just like the heat aspect of things. So generally what these two figures show is that the UK's climate has been getting a lot warmer. So the first graph, you can see the black line is basically the trend line. And since 1819, it's gone up from 11.5 degrees on average to around 13 degrees on average, which is, you know, 2-degree increase is quite a lot. It's also been getting a lot wetter and sunnier than the 20th century, with the top hottest years all occurring since 2002. So the top 10 hottest years. So yeah, in the last 20 years, we've seen the top 10 hottest years since recorded temperatures were taken, which is wild. So yeah, climate change is changing UK weather patterns and it's making them more extreme. And heat waves like that of summer 2018 are now 30 times more likely to happen due to climate change. And this has a lot of serious impacts on our health. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, I didn't know I did that. Okay. Extreme heat is a serious health issue, especially for those with heart and lung conditions, the very young and the very elderly. I think that's everything. Never mind. So it can increase high temperatures increase the risk of hypothermia, which exacerbates the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, migraines. It increases the risk of strokes and cardiovascular diseases. So it's really bad. If you're on certain medications, for example, ADHD medications or antidepressant medications, you're a lot more susceptible to heat. And a lot of people can become heat intolerant. So, they're more likely to faint, they're more likely not to be able to actually go outside and do much because they will just collapse pretty much. And heat stress also and hot weather leads to a lot more aggression, which leads to increased violence and crime. And I heard it in the Hot Take podcast. I think there's an increase of 1.2 or 3% of domestic violence or violent crime on hotter days. So that's quite a huge increase. And I think this was a US-based podcast. So it's like their population is 300 million. 1% of 300 million is still a very big number. So it affects us in a lot of ways, physically, mentally, and socially. So all of this exposes us to a lot more psychological trauma, which I will talk about later in a later slide. Now we're going to move on to tropical disease, which heat also exacerbates. So tropical disease is basically any disease that is indigenous to tropical, subtropical areas like malaria, cholera, yellow fever, West Nile disease, I think it's called, West Nile virus. And so these figures just show what, like climate change, what it causes, and then how this increases the risk of disease. The one on the left and the one on the right just shows the distribution of West Nile virus, which is from like the Nile region, and it was introduced through trade and is becoming more and more prevalent in Europe, which it shouldn't be. And because of increasing temperatures, mosquitoes, for example, a lot more, they're able to survive for a lot longer and live in non-tropical areas. So yeah, many diseases are directly impacted by the warming climate, as they can only exist in certain conditions, i.e. warm, humid environments like tropical conditions, because this allows vectors like mosquitoes to breed and survive there. And the warmer temperatures also mean they'll be more active, so they'll be able to feed on the host more often, they'll be able to reproduce more often. And it also encourages faster development of pathogens which don't need vectors like COVID, for example. So there are already mosquitoes and ticks in Central and Southern Europe, but these aren't necessarily carrying vectors. But other species of mosquito, for example, and tick that do carry these vectors will be able to migrate and live more north and south to countries that are typically more varied in season. Extreme weather events, which are also come along with climate change, will worsen the likelihood of being affected by pathogens like mosquitoes. So mosquitoes need stagnant water to reproduce as well, and they often thrive post-flooding when lots and lots of water is able to stay in one area for a really long time. So things like that also increase the risk of disease presence and transmission. So yeah, next slide, please. Now we're talking about air pollution. So yeah, it's really like a whirlwind of health issues. So yeah, air pollution is a really significant health problem. It's one of the biggest threats to public health, with about 40,000 excess deaths occurring each year in the UK. It's driven primarily from emissions, by emissions from vehicles or industry, which also contribute to overall climate change. And this is a bit of a vicious cycle, as many experts note that like more frequent and intense heat waves caused by climate change lead to more episodes of ozone and particulate matter, i.e. air pollution, which harm health. And of course, the impacts are usually felt by the most deprived communities, and this worsens health inequalities. So yeah, long-term exposure over like years or lifetimes reduces life expectancy due to cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, and also lung cancer. Air pollution is also linked to dementia, cognitive decline, and early life effects, because air pollution triggers a lot of inflammatory processes. It activates the immune system, it damages blood vessels, it causes dysfunction of neurotransmitter systems, i.e. like systems that involve dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, all of these things that you usually hear about in like pop psychology. And over a short period of time, this is really fine. Like our bodies are really, really good at coping with stress. However, when it becomes like a really long-term chronic form of stress that doesn't stop, like you're exposed to these things every single day for years, that's when dysfunction and disease start to occur, because our bodies are always inflamed or they're becoming more and more damaged, unable to actually heal properly. So yeah, long-term exposure to like nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other forms of air pollution have been linked to stress, poor life quality, diagnosis of depression, and suicidal ideation. So a lot of these things I've spoken about, they're really systemic. It's like a mental health thing, a physical health thing. It's not just one or the other, and they tend to overlap too. It's also been linked to like lower IQ in early childhood and affects the developing brains of children. So air pollution really affects people of all ages, but it is something that has like a relatively easy solution, like tree planting, making more green spaces, using less fossil fuels. But of course, it's up to governments to actually implement these changes. So yeah, that is obviously why we're all here, because they don't do much. So yeah, if you go on to the next slide, I will be talking about mental health, because I think this is one thing that people do often think about when it comes to health and climate. So yeah, climate change exposes us to more psychological trauma, and that can be induced by multiple factors, like those related to extreme weather events and natural disasters causing personal loss, destroyed environment, landscapes, infrastructure, communities, decreased food access and more food insecurity, worsened economy, or yeah, a recession, I guess, and impaired financial security. It also obviously causes forced migration and social conflicts, and you can have one of these things or all of them. And in particular, depression and anxiety, PTSD, and substance abuse and suicide rates have been shown in a lot of studies to be increasing with changes in climate conditions. Even short-term exposure to extreme weather or extreme weather events like climate warming or tropical cyclones is associated with worsened mental health. Wildfires, floods, tsunamis are more frequently associated with psychiatric disorders, as they have an immediate and direct impact on mental health, because it disturbs your daily, like your normal routine, and it creates a lot of psychological fragility, which leads to like a lot of anxiety, uncertainty about our futures. And this can be temporary, but it can also lead to like full-blown disorders like PTSD or suicidal thoughts or substance abuse. But a lot of that does have to do with how well you're able to recover, how well your community is able to adapt to these events. And obviously in Global North, we usually have a better ability. Global South, they usually have a worse ability. And again, yeah, they tend to be worse affected by these problems. Not only that, we're seeing more and more people experiencing eco-anxiety. There was a Lancet study that showed that about 84% of people between 16 and 25 were at least moderately worried about living in a climate change world. And another study showed 60% of people between 27 and 45 are worried about having children. They're worried about the state of the futures. And considering that we're seeing things that were predicted to happen in like 2050 or 2100, and they're happening in 2022, it's kind of, yeah, unsurprising. And 45% of people between 16 and 25 said that eco-anxiety was affecting their daily lives and like their ability to function, which is really upsetting, because yeah, it's not really the ages that we should be worrying about our futures per se. We should just be like living life. Unfortunately, yeah, we're not. There's also this concept which is called solastalgia, which is distress experienced when environmental damage happens when you're in one place, so in your home, for example. Because it really disrupts people's sense of identity and security, and it tends to be chronic rather than acute, so it lasts for a really long time. And because it tends to happen when you're already at home, it's not like you can, well, you can't always just leave, and you can't return to your home and to families to just kind of fix things. So it leads people to a lot of despair and hopelessness, and all of this makes it a lot more difficult to adapt to climate change, because when you're not, feeling optimal, doing stuff becomes very difficult very quickly, and yeah, it leads to a lot of kind of other disorders. So it's super important to be aware of these things so you can come up with like adaptive and mitigation strategies in advance rather than not knowing what's going on. And then just one final thing to link all of these together. Just want to talk briefly about like the systems on the next slide. So obviously with all of this happening, healthcare costs are going to skyrocket. A lot of places don't have free healthcare. Lack of appropriately trained and experienced professionals, as we're going to be exposed to a lot more new diseases. University costs are going up. A lot of people aren't really training to be doctors and nurses anymore because of the time commitment, and it's not exactly a lifestyle a lot of people want to live. And you tend to be very overworked, underpaid. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of difficulty in that regard. Because of that, the quality of healthcare will also decrease, because yeah, if healthcare systems are managed the way they currently are, if people who are overworked, they just can't perform the way that is optimal, and people are also not going to be able to access healthcare as much because they won't have doctors, for example. Again, people most marginalized are going to be affected as they're more likely to be affected by the impacts of climate change, and they're usually not likely to get the same quality of healthcare due to, ableism or racism and other kind of forms of discrimination. And yeah, that's kind of all I had to say on that. And I just wanted to use that to wrap up how this all affects us in a social way as well. So yeah, thank you for listening to my part. I hope it made sense and I hope it wasn't too fast. But yeah, thank you.
Bobby, would you mind sharing my part as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk you all through effective climate change communication, which I may be a bit biased, but I think it's one of the most or biggest challenges we're facing in the fight against climate change. Because we see many scientists, they really know what they're doing and they really know their subject area, but a lot of them are not out there communicating the science. So we really need more scientists and also more campaigners to, learn communication skills and really bring the message out there to people who don't usually engage with the climate crisis. Can we have the next slide, please? So I've got 4 golden rules for climate change communication, which are super simplified. But before we go into those, I want to present 2 concepts to you. The first one being spheres of influence. So we all navigate in different social systems or social circles. That can be, for example, your friendship groups or your work or your local community or hobbies, sports groups, etc. And all of those circles or spheres of influence allow you to reach and influence different people. So the outermost circle in light blue are actions you want to see on a governmental level. So for example, ambitious climate policies. And that circle or sphere may look really inaccessible to us, but actually we can, transcend those spheres of influence in order to affect change on a governmental level. So your friends and family are in the sphere, closest to you, and you can influence them very directly. So that's the orange circle. The dark green circle is people you can influence in your community. So for example, I'm doing a talk at my local bookshop in 2 weeks, and that will allow me to reach people I don't usually reach in day-to-day life because they're not in my friend circle and I don't work with them, but they are in my community, so they're still fairly accessible to me. The light green circle is members of the public we can influence. So we can do that through social media, for example, or being a spokesperson and going on local or national media. So that in that way, you can reach people that are not in your networks, but those mediums will allow you to jump or transcend those spheres in order to reach, people outside your network. So question to you, and you can answer this in the chat. You can speak up and unmute yourself if you feel like it. Could you tell me which spheres or which sphere we can use to reach people in government in the light blue sphere? Does anyone have an idea? Which sphere can we target in order to reach government? All of them, very good. Anyone think that one sphere might be more important than the other? The one just below? So influencing the public, yeah. Very good. So all of them is almost correct. I'm pretty sure you can use all of them or you can target all of them to reach government somehow. The ones I was thinking of were the purple circle, so people just outside our networks, and we can do that, for example, by emailing our MP. So our MP is someone who is very accessible to us. As their constituents, they kind of have to reply to our email, or at least they should. And obviously, when your MP is actually interested in what you have to say, they can bring that into government. So that can give you that direct link into government by contacting your local MP. Obviously, not all MPs are like that. And when we can't communicate very well with our MP, we can also target our wider community, the dark green circle, by, for example, organizing a protest locally in our community, which can then also lead to, media reaching that light green circle. We can also do that by organizing digital campaigns. targeting MPs on Twitter, or what we've been doing at Stop Rosebank, organizing digital days of action, etc., which gave us a platform and allowed us to reach a lot of politicians. So really, we can use a lot of these spheres for influence to transfer our personal influence and reach people we wouldn't normally be able to reach on an individual level or in our immediate communities. Next slide, please. The second concept I want to introduce is the elephant and rider. So we like to think of ourselves as really rational and logical human beings, but that unfortunately is mostly a fantasy. We're not very logical, we're not very rational, and actually we're not very conscious in the first place. So our brain works mostly automatically based on our memory, our habits, etc. And that's what we call the elephant. That's our automatic, our emotional brain. And the other 10% is our conscious and rational brain that makes decisions very actively. Now the 90% and the 10%, they're very simplified, and scientists do disagree on this a little bit, but there is actually quite a bit of evidence showing that we mostly work based on our opinions and habits. So what you really want to do is play to people's emotions. And that's a strategy that's really, really effective, even in, negotiating spaces. So if you ever attend a negotiating training, I did one a couple of months ago, you will really learn that it's all about emotions and all about people's first impressions. So in negotiating spaces, one tactic that's really popular is just flattering people. Googling people, finding out stuff about them, and then going there and flattering, making them feel good. And that's really how you can convince someone to support your cause, which, is a bit, I always find it a bit sad that, we have to resort to that, but people respond to emotions way, way better than information. So just keep that in mind. And it also means that storytelling is a very, very effective approach. So I did some research with Imperial College on effective climate communication, and we found that storytelling, together with solutions-based framing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is the most effective climate change communication approach. So that's stuff like, visual storytelling, producing videos, writing essays, writing fiction, games and play, and bringing climate into that can be very, very effective, especially with younger audiences. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to chat about the 5 golden rules for communication. And is everyone here vaguely familiar with the spectrum of allies? Just put yes or no in the chat, just so I have a bit of an idea if you have seen it before. No. Oh, a good mix of people, actually. So basically the spectrum of allies basically shows us, it's an exercise you do before you start a campaign, and you figure out, okay, so who cares about our cause but is not necessarily involved? Those are the passive allies. Active allies are people, like us, activists who are already involved with a campaign. People who are neutral are, the kind of people who don't really think about climate change. They're not really engaged. Passive opposition are people who, think activists are, crusties, don't really like us, but they're still a little bit worried about climate change. Huge simplification. And active opposition are people like, I don't know, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, or Rishi Sunak, who are very much free market fanatics and don't really care much about climate change and actively introduce policies that are not necessarily helpful. So, important thing to keep in mind when we communicate about the climate crisis, most people are either in the neutral categories or passive allies. Like Danny just said, a lot of people are worried about climate change, but most people don't really know what to do about it. A lot of people feel powerless. A lot of people don't really know where to start. A lot of people don't actually know that they can affect change in the first place. So when you decide on your target groups, they're not necessarily your active allies, because they're people who are mostly already involved, and they're not necessarily the active opposition, because it's very, very difficult to convince those people. So if you're an experienced communicator, you can aim for, the passive opposition, maybe even the active opposition, because there is value in, holding those people accountable. But if you're fairly new to climate communication, you really want to target the neutral category and the passive allies. Right, can we go to the 5 golden rules? So 5 golden rules. Number 1, avoid making people feel powerless. Knowing your audience, knowing who you're talking to. Show, don't tell is very catchy, basically means demonstrate success stories. Avoid jargon, both visually and verbally. And lastly, diversify your tactics. And we're going to talk about each of these now. Next slide, please. Could you please tell me in the chat how these headlines make you feel? How do these headlines make you feel? Hopeless, sad, mad, defeated, terrified? Yeah. Hopeless, stressed, yeah. Difficult to know what to do. Yeah, very good, very good. So these headlines is what we call climate doomism. And doomism is often, it often comes from a very well-meaning place, because it's very tempting to, sound the alarm bell and tell people what might happen if we don't act on the climate crisis. But I basically did some research with Imperial College, and we did something which we call a meta-analysis, which is basically a review of all the research that's out there on climate change communication. And what we found is that fear-based messaging is really ineffective in motivating people to take action on the climate crisis or sustainability issues in general. And often that kind of messaging can turn into doomism. So doomism is the belief that it's already too late to stop climate change. And what I often say personally is that doomism really plays directly into the hands of those who do not want us to take action, the people who benefit the most from the climate crisis. Again, it often comes from a well-meaning place, but it's not very effective in motivating people to join a climate group or implement changes in their own lives. And one quote I really like from Rebecca Solnit is, "Giving up is a luxury," because basically, our refusal to act because we've convinced ourselves that it's too late anyway, is an act of betrayal to those, in the most affected regions in the global south who are already facing, the impact of the climate crisis. And for those people who are already affected, giving up is not really an option because it's about survival. So, for us to say, it's too late anyway, I'm not going to do anything, it really comes from a place of privilege. So what do we do instead? Can we see the next slide, please? So obviously we want to avoid toxic positivity, and we do want to validate people's feelings. And we want to allow people to, lean into those feelings of anxiety and despair, and, really accept that those feelings are real and they're important, but then channel that into action. We also want to be really careful not to play down the crisis, because climate change is really dire, it is really urgent. And we also don't want to play into corporate greenwashing. So it is difficult to strike a balance. And I make mistakes all the time in my communication, but I do try and find that sweet spot in the middle between, doomism and being overly positive. And I try and use these 3 building blocks of urgency, hope, and solutions. So, for example, a relatively doomist headline could be, "Politicians have failed us and we are racing towards 2.5 degrees of global warming." It doesn't really tell us, what we can do or whether there's any point in acting in the first place. So an alternative to that statement could be, "Politicians are failing us, and in order to avoid climate breakdown, we must take urgent action now and roll out renewables at scale," or, or home insulation or climate justice. Basically insert your solution. But it's really, really crucial that we follow up with a solution. And, this can be counterintuitive sometimes, because our brains have evolved to pay more attention to negative information as a survival mechanism. Because, our brain needs to respond very quickly if there's a tiger, coming at us to eat us. So our brains have actually evolved to respond to that in a very, very visceral way. But what the research tells us is that, yes, we do pay more attention to negative information, but we are more motivated by solutions. So while solutions-oriented messaging will get you less attention, it will get you more action. Can we have the next slide, please? So when you structure your communication, there's many different aspects to take into account, such as political beliefs of your target audience, their socio-demographic background, and also the intersections of all of those identity factors. And we will send you some resources in the next couple of days with lots of reading material. One piece of research I find really interesting is that you need to, or you want to, communicate or talk about different climate impacts based on the age group of your target audience. For example, young people react or respond more to drought, sea level rise, or flooding, so more, acute impacts of climate change. Whereas older generations are more worried about food and water security, for example. So things that affect them more directly rather than, wider reaching climate impacts. And as I said, those things will interact with other identities, which is why it's so important, like Danny said, to view all this from an intersectional lens. But these are the tendencies we see just between age groups. And we're also going to include this research in your resource pack. Next slide, please. The third golden rule is to demonstrate successes. There's a lot of research showing that people are really motivated when they see what's possible when we take climate action. And really, this is an issue of imagination, because we've been told for decades now, centuries even, that capitalism and resource extraction is kind of the way it's always been, although that's not true. And we've had this story of capitalism being hammered into our brains, to the point where our imagination has been taken away from us, and we don't really know what the alternative to capitalism could be, and resource extraction, and the human nature divide. So really reclaiming that imagination and sharing it with others can be really powerful. So we can see, for example, in the top left corner, that's Hugh Richards. So he's a guy who lives near where I live in Wales, and he is completely self-sufficient, grows a lot of food, and really lives in harmony with the land around him. Super, super inspiring. On the right, we see the first solar-powered village in India, which is a story I learned about a couple of weeks ago, and it's really, really beautiful because it's actually really improved people's quality of life. And reduce people's energy bills by like up to 100%. So also really great to see. Bottom left, we see community energy in the UK. Again, it made communities really resilient against the energy price crisis. And on the bottom right, we see a recent campaign win by, I think they're called People and Planet, and they got 100 universities to divest from fossil fuels. So if you want to recruit people into the climate movement, it's really important to talk about campaign successes. For example, the UK climate emergency, which was basically exile blocking the roads for 10 days until the UK government declared a climate emergency as the first country in the world. Cambo, obviously, the Cambo oil field being paused, that was pretty sure a direct result of our great campaign last year. So those are really things you want to stress if you're trying to get people to join the climate movement. The first question you will get is, what point does it make? What can I do as an individual? And what can we do collectively? Next slide. The fourth golden rule is avoiding jargon and making your communication very accessible. So this is based on a guide from Neon, which we're also going to include in your resource pack. So a lot of people are not very familiar with terms like climate justice or systems change, especially if they know people from the general public who are not engaged with climate change, who are not activists, etc. So it's very easy for us to just assume that people know those terms, but actually there was some research from Climate Outreach showing that I think like 60 or 70% of people in the UK have absolutely no relationship or relation with the term climate justice. They don't know what it means, and actually if we use that term, people feel deterred from engaging with climate content further. So what you want to do, because some of these terms are obviously very important, you want to either define them in a very accessible way or say something else. depending on your audience again. So instead of climate justice, for example, you could say equality and justice to tackle climate change, which basically means exactly the same thing, but it's a lot more accessible. Instead of systems change, we could say we need to redesign our economy. Instead of greenhouse gases, if you talk to someone who doesn't know anything about climate change, you can just say polluting gases, because that's something that people can visually imagine. Adaptation, the changes we need to make. Circular economy, reducing and reusing products, and decarbonization, we can just say we have to stop using fossil fuels. So these are just some examples, and obviously it will depend on who you're talking to and what people's level of experience is with climate issues. Next slide, please. Who can tell me what's wrong with this graph, with this data visualization? Factually, there's nothing wrong with it. It's basically showing us global heating over time. But from a communication perspective, what's wrong with it? Literally can't read it. Ugly, yeah. Difficult to understand. Acronyms are confusing, yeah. Too crowded, yeah. Very hard to decipher. Yeah, so basically this is global heating over time. There's nothing wrong with this graph, but it's not very engaging. Can we have the next slide, please? So instead of this kind of data, really what you want to use is something like climate stripes, which is showing us exactly the same thing. So this is showing us average temperatures over time. Obviously, so this is from 1850 to 2021. And we can very clearly see, it starts with cooler average temperatures a couple of centuries back, and the hottest years in history have all been quite recently. So since the climate stripes have been developed, they've become very iconic. Lots of people, wear them on face masks and bags, and it's something that's become fashionable and iconic and eye-catching. So really, this is the kind of stuff we want to do with our data. Make it memorable and make it very easy to understand. Next slide, please. And lastly, we want to diversify our tactics, especially as activists and climate communicators. So in my opinion, one of the things that made the Stop Cambo and Stop Rosebank campaign very successful is that we used a diversity of tactics. So some of the things we did were, we have a spokesperson group where we go to the media, we do media interviews, we speak at protests. We also have digital campaigns. We get people to post selfies with Stop Rosebank signs on social media. So these are the kind of things you can do as a campaigner. But more generally, there's so many environments where you can talk about climate change. In the pub, for example, that's why there's a picture of a pub next to a picture of a protest. And depending on those environments, you want to communicate in different ways. So you can see Michaela here in the bottom left corner. And some of you will remember this story. If not, you can Google Extinction Rebellion, Michaela Loach, 2020, I believe, 2019, which is a really, really great example of climate communication in a protest environment, because what Michaela did is use really emotional language and talk about how she was really afraid of the future and their future. So really good example of climate communication. Also this is also an approach you want to use if you're in the pub with your friends. And I always say that one of the most powerful things you can do as a climate communicator is talk to your friends and family about it, because that normalizes the issue, and it also normalizes activism when we talk about our work as communicators and our work as activists. And yeah, just some other examples. You want to communicate differently depending on whether you're at a protest, on the BBC, in a very formal environment like COP27. So yeah, your strategy will really depend on where you are and who you're talking to, and it can be very difficult to get it right, but there are many guides you can use to take a trial and error approach, because that's pretty much the way to go, and we're going to send you all of those resources after this training. And I'm going to hand back to Bobby now.
And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about climate economics and policy. The way that I always start these sessions is that I preface this by saying that I'm not an economist. I've spent time studying it during my undergrad and my postgrad degrees, and I've had endless debates about metaphors of pieces of pie or growth. So what we're going to do in today's session is we're going to dive a little bit into economics of climate change, and then we're going to look a little bit at policy. And my hope is that you will come away from this session with ammunition to tackle even the most overconfident climate denier finance bro. So the first question that I have for you, if you could put your answers in the chat, and I absolutely love asking people this question: what does economics make you think of? Complicated, love that one. Money, very important. Maths, yeah, that's a painful one. Posh men, well, that's kind of ironic given that I'm the one giving this presentation, but we move. Donuts, fantastic, love that answer. Clearly a Kate Raworth fan in the house. Makes me feel dumb. Chris, I have been there. I'm probably still am there. I feel like economics is quite a loaded term. Growth, Molly, love that one. Robert Peston, iconic voice, iconic man. Stock market, money, capitalism, astrology. Cedric, I would love you to expand on that at some point. That's a really good one. Exploitation of humans, fiction, so many different answers here, love it. Neoliberalism, a financial construct created by the haves to keep the have-nots on their knees. I love that one. And I think it was Molly who said growth, and that puts us in a very good position to talk about what growth is, because it's such a big buzzword. We're always hearing about it, but what does it actually mean? I feel like the word growth has been really co-opted, because growth is a word that we find in nature. I feel like when you're a child, you associate growth with plants and with springtime and flowers and all of the great things that come in that time of the year. But over time, this word growth has become a money word, an economic word, a word about the changes in society and how that's going to fuel and impact different inequalities. So traditionally, growth is measured as something called GDP, or gross domestic product. And it's a bit of a complicated term, but it's basically the total value of what we call goods and services that are produced within the boundaries of a country within a given time period. So goods are tangible items that you can hold, like cars or appliances or clothing. And services are tasks that are performed for the people in the society, like water, electricity, and gas to your homes. Now, because of the differences between sizes of populations of different countries, we usually call this in economics GDP per capita, or how well a nation is doing by economic growth per individual person. And when we talk about growth, we're almost always talking about an increase in this idea of GDP per capita or per person. So why do we care so much about GDP, and well, where does it come from? It might surprise you if you don't know already that this idea of GDP came from the Second World War. There was an economist at Cambridge University called John Maynard Keynes, who he wanted to calculate how much the British economy could produce during this time of war. And he thought that this should be done by adding together the consumption of individuals as well as investment and the amount that the government was spending. Now, it might also not surprise you to know that a measure from the Second World War is probably not so useful today. And one of the key criticisms of GDP, well, there are many. Is it a good measure? Do you guys think it's a good measure? Maybe you could put your answers in the chat of whether you think growth or GDP are good measures of how we're doing as countries and as societies. I'm seeing some no's. Does anyone think it's a good measure, or shall I just press on with the no's? Lots of no's. All right, let's press on. Yeah, the answer is not really. There are lots and lots of ways in which it isn't a good measure of how we're doing. Quite simply, it ignores the negative effects of the economy on society. So it doesn't take into account things like income inequality, which obviously is a really key issue. I see Heather saying in the chat that we need measures based on well-being, and that is indeed absolutely something that we do need in our economic systems. Something that's also really important is the idea that it's all focused on averages rather than the distribution of wealth in a society. So in the chat, can you tell me who is the richest person in the world? They have been in the news recently, so I'm sure we're going to get this very quickly. Elon, yes, Elon is indeed the richest person in the world. And his net worth is a staggering 220 billion US dollars. Let that one sink in for a moment. Now, if you were to line up all of the people in the United States of America, all 320 million of them in a line, and you have all of their incomes and you pick the middle person, they would make 31,000 US dollars per year, which makes Elon Musk about 8 million times wealthier than the average American. But the USA is sort of considered as the most economically prosperous country traditionally. That doesn't really make sense, does it? How can you have such an imbalanced society? I think another really key thing to look at is the idea that economic growth tends to be less well measured or accurately measured in poorer countries. And a big part of this is the fact that wealthier countries invest more in measuring the metrics simply because it makes them look better. Now, growth does also counterintuitively mean that really bad things are happening. And this is linked to the last point, environmental damage. The production of the goods that I was talking about before contributes to growth, but these goods might also create damage to ecosystems or to people through smog, to pollution of air or water bodies. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about overpopulation. Now, you might have spoken about this in the last breakout room, and I think it's a really, really key point because it's unfortunately an argument that gets spoken about so often these days. Now, this is the only economics curve that I'm putting into my presentation, I promise, because I don't want to put too many curves into your life. Now, this curve is called the environmental Kuznets curve, and it's a very ultimately environmentally racist graph, but it explains a lot of what's behind the overpopulation argument we often see. And it's based on the idea, you can see here, that as countries get richer, so down here, they're passing through the different stages of what's called economic development. They are creating more environmental damage on this axis. So you can see as they're passing through economic development, their environmental damage is going up. And according to this theory, if countries become richer, eventually they will just stop producing emissions, and then their emissions will start to go down as they continue to become richer. This isn't something that really makes sense to a lot of us, I'm sure. And you might have heard lots of terms going around before, like developed and developing countries, first, second, third world. These terms are a little bit out of date now. So I'm going to use terms called low-income countries and high-income countries. There are also higher, medium, and lower medium income countries, but for this specific moment of today, we're going to speak about low and high income countries. So to give you an idea of the differences in emissions produced by lower income and higher income countries today, per person, per year, how many times more emissions do you think people in high income countries produce than the people in lower income countries? So comparing the people in lower income countries and higher income countries, how many times more emissions do you think people in higher income countries are producing? We've got Claudia coming in with 50, Elena with 80, Caroline with 80, 200, 400, lots of guesses coming in here. The answer is that on average, higher income countries are producing 43 times higher emissions than lower income countries. And to articulate this point even further, we're going to zoom in on a couple of countries from those groups. So I chose the USA as our stock example higher income country, and I chose a country at random from the group of lower income countries, and that country is Zambia. Now, the same question, how many more tons of carbon dioxide do you think are produced by a person in the USA than in Zambia? We got a 400, 50, 80, 70. Let's keep those guesses coming in. I'm going to see if anyone gets it exactly. We've got a 76, 60, 56, 300, 250. The correct answer, unfortunately, I hate to have done this to you, it's a trick question. The answer is also 43 times higher, and this is just a coincidence, I promise. I was writing this section and I chose a country at random, and it just happened to also be 43 to the nearest whole number. So there we go. Now, I wonder I highly doubt it unless anyone is really obsessed with figures in economic policy. Does anyone know who this man is? I would be stunned. It would blow me away if anyone knows who this guy is. Now, this guy is an American economist called Greg Mankiw. Generic, stale, pale, white male. Love that. Greg Mankiw is an American macroeconomist. So he looks at countries and the world and sort of some of the bigger parts of economics. And he is a really highly ranked economist. And you might remember in Danny's presentation earlier today, we were hearing about how a lot of academia is skewed by rankings. This guy is great at getting cited and being really, really high up in rankings. 2 years ago, he was ranked as the 45th most influential economist in the world. So why am I talking to you about Gregory Mankiw and hope? Because surely this wouldn't bring you to a story of hope. I want to share a little bit of an anecdote with you. 11 years ago yesterday, Greg was teaching a class at Harvard because that's where he's an economics professor. Now, the students in his class staged a walkout because they were so dissatisfied with the curriculum that they were being taught. They were really tired of the traditional notions of economics and growth that were being taught to them. And they were thinking that these are methods that are actively detrimental to the future and actively harmful to society. And this was the start of a global movement that spread really quickly around the world to students in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Scandinavian countries, all over, organizing and also staging walkouts and challenging their professors on the notions of economics that were being taught to them, because they were so confused about the difference between the notions of growth that they were being taught was so good and what the reality was that they were seeing in the world. And economics is changing. You're seeing more and more figures who are coming to the fore who are thinking about economics in different ways. Someone earlier today mentioned Kate Raworth and donut economics, and that is one of the many offshoots of renegade economics, as it's being called, that is changing the scope of what we can call neoclassical or traditional economics and reimagining a world that prioritizes well-being and things other than strictly financial growth for countries. So the future is changing and the future is bright. So unfortunately, today we don't have time to go into the specifics of things like donut economics and circular economy, but we've got some resources for you in your after session packs, which hopefully will make you interested and then you can go and explore these things. So we're going to speak for a couple of minutes now before rounding up about policy and economics. Are they a match made in heaven? Is this a hideous joke? Now, we've got a picture on the screen. In the chat, could you just say what this picture makes you think of and what you think I'm trying to say with this picture? Olivia saying Earth systems collapse. Danny, we're screwed. Global warming and stripping of resources, our current reality. All of these things are absolutely true. I see Molly saying that these are the impacts of economic and political choices. The answer really lies in all of these things, but also in short-term political thinking. We were asked to speak a little bit about decision-making and the policy process and what that means. And I think this is a really key part of it. What this picture represents is the idea that local policies and short-term political decisions have global impacts. We've organized ourselves into nations over the last couple of 100 years, and that makes international cooperation on policy one of our biggest challenges. In the next couple of days, we're going to see world leaders gather for COP27 and attempt to make international decisions with national interests in their minds. Most politicians have very short political terms of 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And that's the amount of time they spend in office. So they use this as the main reason why they shouldn't make longer term plans, because ultimately their key interest is being voted back in. So for the final part of our time today, we're going to speak really quickly about how something becomes law in the UK. Now, the truth is that it's a really complicated process, so let's dive into it. The first thing is that we have something that is called a bill, and this is a proposed new law. Now, a bill can be proposed by any MP of any party, and then you have what's called a first reading, which is this step here. And this is basically MPs being told that a bill will be proposed and what it's about. and MPs can then use this time to prepare and discuss the bill. Now, we heard Jessica talk earlier about flattery as a negotiation method, and this is one of the really, really key things that comes in with bills, because informal networks are so important between MPs in getting bills approved. And that's also something that you can use when you are challenging the different steps of this process and challenging people who are involved in the different steps of this process. So then we have the second reading, in which the details of the bill are discussed on the floor of the House of Commons. And then from this moment, we have these two steps labeled C and R, which are the committee and report stages. So smaller groups of MPs or committees can examine the bill in lots and lots of details, and their policy assistants will prepare documents and summaries that are explaining the different parts of the bill. And they then report on this to the House. Then there is the third reading, where the bill is debated and there is a vote. And a majority of MPs have to support the bill in order for it to go through. So if a party has a majority in government, in Parliament, it makes them a lot easier for them to pass laws. Now, the next step is the House of Lords, where this process repeats in a similar way. And what the House of Lords can do is pass a bill back to the House of Commons to be looked at again. And then once a bill is agreed by both houses, it will receive what is called royal assent, where the monarch ceremonially approves this new bill before it is written into law.
Amazing. Really glad you had a good time. So that was the end of our training. We are going to host a little Q&A. If you have to leave, please do leave. If you have any questions, but you have to leave, feel free to send us an email. But we're just going to hold space for another 10 minutes or so, just to answer any questions you may have, or reflections from the breakout room if you want to share any.